Rain glazed the windows of St. Jude's Hospital like a veil of quiet sorrow, muting the chaos inside. Nurses moved with practiced grace through the sterile corridors, the scent of antiseptic and anxiety hanging in the air. Among them, Clara Reyes walked with purpose, her chestnut hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun, her pale blue scrubs clinging damply to her skin from her sprint across the parking lot. 12-hour shifts were her norm, but today felt heavier. There was a weight in the pit of her stomach that hadn't come from missed meals or fatigue. It was the kind of heaviness that whispered of something just out of sight, something looming. She had just slipped into the trauma bay when the call came through. Incoming MVA, male, late 30s, GCS-10, probable head injury, chest trauma, ETA 3 minutes. Clara didn't blink, she moved. When the paramedics wheeled him in, the man's face was obscured by blood and oxygen tubing. The left side of his chest was covered in bruises, his shirt sliced away, revealing a constellation of injuries. There was a tremor in the way his body tried to breathe. Clara stepped in as Dr. Ahmed called out vitals, securing lines, stabilizing his neck, assessing injuries with calm precision. Her gloved hands moved instinctively. She didn't look at his face until they began cleaning away the blood. And when she did, her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen him in 6 years, but there he was, Aiden Wolf. The man who had ruined her life. His name still sent a pulse of heat and shame through her. Aiden Wolf, CEO of Wolf and Warner Pharmaceuticals, heir to a legacy of wealth and calculated ambition. He was the man whose decisions had destroyed the clinic her father had spent a lifetime building. The man whose legal team had bled her family dry after her father's wrongful termination suit, leaving them bankrupt and broken. The scandal had devoured their reputation. Her father had never recovered. He died 2 years later of a heart attack, a silent, bitter collapse of a man who had once believed in healing. Clara stood there, torn between the cold weight of memory and the clinical duty that had been drilled into her marrow. She should have turned away, she should have walked out and let someone else take over, but she didn't. Because Clara Reyes was a nurse. And this man she had every reason to hate, was her patient. Clara, Dr. Ahmed said, not noticing her pallor, I need you on this, he's crashing. She moved forward without a word. As they stabilized him, her hands never wavered. Her voice remained steady, but inside her thoughts howled. Later, when he was sedated and safely in the ICU, Clara leaned against the wall outside his room, her fingers trembling slightly. Her friend and fellow nurse, Jamie, passed her a cup of lukewarm coffee. You good? Jamie asked, peering at her with concern. You went pale in there. Clara nodded slowly, just a long shift. She didn't say what she was really thinking. She didn't say that she'd just saved the life of the man whose empire had crushed her father's. That night, long after visiting hours ended and the halls grew quiet, Clara slipped back into the ICU. She stood at the window of room 412, watching Aiden lie unconscious, the ventilator hissing softly beside him. His face was bruised, the bandage at his temple stark against his pale skin. For a moment, stripped of his suits and steel, he looked nothing like the man who had once sat at a press conference and dismissed her father's clinic as unfortunate collateral damage. She wanted to hate him, but what she felt was more complicated than hate. It was a flicker of something she couldn't name, a question she didn't want to ask. In the days that followed, Aiden remained unconscious. The hospital couldn't reach any family, his records were sealed tight behind corporate lawyers and privacy clauses. Clara found herself assigned to his case more often than not. She told herself it was a coincidence, but she knew it was. She watched over him, monitored his vitals, adjusted his IVs. She knew the shape of his injuries better than she knew the color of her own eyes, and with each passing day, the bitterness she'd held for so long twisted into something unfamiliar. One morning, as sunlight filtered through half-closed blinds, he opened his eyes. It was slow, a flicker of lashes and a long, pained blink. Clara was checking his chart when she felt the shift. She looked up and their eyes met. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Where? His voice was gravel, broken and unsure. You're at St. Jude, Clara said quietly. You were in a car accident. You've been unconscious for 5 days. He blinked again, his brow furrowing. Then, as if some slow recognition stirred behind his gaze, he murmured, Do I know you? Clara froze. He didn't remember her. The irony was sharp. The man who had shattered her life had no idea who she was. No, she said finally, you don't. She turned away before he could see the way her fingers clenched. From that moment on, everything changed. The first thing Aiden Wolf noticed once the haze of medication began to lift was how quiet everything felt. A low, persistent ache pulsed through his chest like a second heartbeat, and when he moved even slightly, pain lit up his ribs like a warning flare. But beneath the discomfort was something stranger, an emptiness, a blank where days should have been. He couldn't remember the accident, couldn't recall how he got here. Couldn't place the nurse with the steady voice and the eyes that watched him like they held secrets. She was there again the next morning. "Good," she said softly, adjusting his monitors. "You're more lucid today." "What happened?" His voice came easier now, though still rough. "Single car crash, rain, speed, hydroplaning, you were lucky." He studied her face. There was a steadiness to her, a kind of strength woven into the quietness. She didn't flinch when he looked too long, but there was something in her eyes, tension maybe or restraint, that kept him from asking more. "Do you work in ICU regularly?" he asked, trying to place her tone, her presence, anything about her. "I rotate," she said, "depends on the needs." There was no warmth in her voice, but no coldness either. Just the kind of careful neutrality he imagined nurses were trained to perfect. Still, something in him stirred uneasily. "Thank you," he said after a beat, "for whatever you did." She hesitated, then almost reluctantly she replied, "I was part of the team. You had a lot of people fighting for you." He tried to hold her gaze, but she turned away to check his chart. He didn't press. Outside of her presence, the days blurred. Aiden spent long hours in pain management, physical therapy, quiet reflection. He hated the helplessness, hated depending on others to do what once came as easily as breathing. But what unnerved him most was how the woman, Clara, he'd learned from a passing orderly, stayed at the edges of his recovery like a shadow that never quite left. He began noticing the way she held tension in her shoulders when he asked questions, how she smiled at other patients but not at him. She was always professional, always efficient, yet always slightly distant. And one night, after a particularly difficult session with physical therapy left him gasping in bed, Clara came in to adjust his pillows. He watched her in silence until he couldn't hold the question back. "Do you hate me?" She froze. Her hand hovered above his blanket, then slowly lowered. "I don't hate my patients," she said quietly. "But you know me," he said, "don't you?" Her silence answered him before she did. "I know who you are." "Did I do something to you?" he asked, hating how uncertain he sounded. She turned to the window, where night pressed like a held breath against the glass. "You don't remember, do you?" "I remember what I've done professionally, but if this is personal, My father was Dr. Raphael Reyes. He ran a free community clinic in Greystone. He sat up straighter, breath hitching. The name clicked like a lock he hadn't opened in years. "You're his daughter." "I'm the nurse who saved your life," she said, "and yes, I'm also the daughter of the man your company destroyed." Her voice wasn't sharp, there was no venom in it, just fact, and that made it worse. "I didn't know," he said. I don't remember all the specifics. There were legal teams, partners, I sign off on hundreds of decisions a month, and..." "That's the problem," she said. "It was paperwork to you, for us it was everything." She didn't wait for a reply. She left the room as quietly as she'd come. After that, silence returned like a tide. Clara still did her rounds. She still checked his vitals, administered medication, monitored his recovery. But something had shifted between them. Aiden watched her with the helpless awareness of a man who had wandered into the ruins of something he didn't know he'd burned down. The more he learned, the worse it became. From overheard conversations and late-night Googling on his hospital tablet, he pieced together what had happened. His company had terminated Dr. Reyes after a dispute over drug pricing and refusal to adopt Wolf and Warner's proprietary treatment program. The clinic had lost its major donor. Lawsuits had followed, allegations of defamation. Her father had died shortly after the final court ruling, and the clinic closed within the year. It wasn't one decision, it was dozens, hundreds. A domino line of policies and signatures and decisions made far above the human cost. Aiden had been at the top of it all. He lay awake at night with that knowledge like a lead weight on his chest. Weeks passed. His recovery progressed. He could walk now slowly with assistance. His ribs healed, the bandages at his temple were removed, the bruises faded. The hospital began preparing for his discharge. And still Clara came. She didn't talk much after that night, but she was never cruel, just distant, just tired. Until one afternoon, after helping him back into bed from a walk around the unit, she lingered. He waited, watching her through the hum of the machines. "Why did you do it?" he asked finally. "Why save me?" She looked at him then, and something deep in her eyes flickered. Not anger, not even grief. because she had already grieved. You were dying, she said, and I'm a nurse, that's it. But it isn't, he said. You could have stepped away. No one would have blamed you. She hesitated, then sat in the chair beside him for the first time in weeks. My father taught me something before he died, she said. He said pain only wins if we let it turn us cruel. He believed healing was a choice we make over and over, even when no one deserves it. Aiden didn't answer right away. His throat ached with the weight of unspoken things. I'm sorry, he said. She stood slowly, the chair creaking as she rose. You can't fix it, she replied. I know, he said, but I want to try. She didn't respond, but she didn't walk away either. That night, long after her shift had ended, Clara stood outside the hospital doors watching the rain return. She remembered the sound of her father's laugh, the way he used to hum while making morning coffee. She remembered the empty echo of the clinic after the last patients were turned away. And then she remembered the way Aiden had looked at her today, not like a CEO, not like a man used to getting what he wanted, but like someone slowly beginning to understand what he'd broken. For the first time in years, she let herself believe that maybe pain didn't have to be permanent. Maybe redemption could be slow. Maybe it could begin with honesty. She tucked her hands into her coat pockets and didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it did and she was still here. Aiden's discharge day arrived under a pale winter sun that streamed half-heartedly through the ICU windows. Clara didn't come to say goodbye. She'd traded shifts with another nurse, quietly, without explanation. It wasn't avoidance out of cowardice, it was self-preservation. Because part of her was afraid that if she saw him walk out, healed and composed and returning to the world that had once torn hers apart, she'd question everything she'd held steady these past weeks. But life, with its cruel sense of timing, wasn't done with either of them. 2 weeks later, Clara was helping triage a stack of patients after a storm-related power outage in Eastbridge, when she heard her name called from across the hall. Clara Reyes. She turned, expecting a patient's family or perhaps a new intern. Instead, it was him. Aiden Wolfe stood in the entryway to the ER, dressed simply in jeans and a dark wool coat, a man far removed from the tailored suits she remembered seeing in press photos. His limp was still visible, but he looked different somehow, less invincible. What are you doing here? She asked, keeping her voice even. He took a breath, his hand tightening slightly around a folder. I'm not here as a patient, he said. I need 5 minutes. I'm working. I know, but I also know you go on break in 10. I'll wait. True to his word, he sat down in the corner of the waiting room, not pressuring, not watching her with expectation. Clara felt the minutes stretch thin as she finished her rounds, her chest taut with the tension of whatever was coming. When she finally approached him, she kept her posture guarded. What do you want, Aiden? He stood slowly and handed her the folder. This is everything, all the contracts, the meeting notes, internal memos from the case with your father. I had a lawyer dig through it all, not the company's lawyer, mine, independently. Clara stared at the folder, unmoving. I don't want to relive that, she said. I know, he said, but you deserve to know the truth, not the polished version. And what would that change? Her voice was tight. You were still the one at the top. He nodded. I made choices without thinking about the fallout. I signed things I didn't read closely because I trusted the system we built. I told myself we were helping people, even as we cut funding to clinics like your father's. I thought I was doing the right thing. And now I know better. Clara didn't take the folder. She simply watched him, trying to find the lie in his posture, in his voice. But it wasn't there. He wasn't just apologizing. He was ashamed. What are you planning to do with it? She asked. I stepped down from the board last week, sold 1/3 of my shares. I'm starting a foundation for independent, community-run health programs. It's not just in your father's name, but I've already spoken to former staff from the Greystone Clinic. Some want to come back. Clara blinked, stunned. Her silence stretched too long and she knew it, but part of her was still trying to catch up. You think this fixes it? No, he said, nothing fixes what happened, but it's a start. And it's not about me, it's about what he built and what people like me took away. She looked at the folder again. This time she reached for it. He didn't smile, he didn't try to soften the moment. He just watched her, quiet and steady. As she opened the first page, her fingers trembled slightly. There were signatures she recognized, dates she remembered too well. But there was also something else, margins annotated in Aiden's handwriting, questions scribbled in frustration, records of meetings where he'd started pushing back. It hadn't been a total act of ignorance. Toward the end, at least, it looked like he had tried to slow it all down. It wasn't enough, but it was something. She looked up at him, her voice softer now. Why are you doing this, really? His answer was simple. Because I'm tired of being the man who ruined your life. There was no romantic pretense in his tone, no calculated charm. Just a man trying to clean up a mess that had buried more than he ever realized. They stood in silence for a moment longer. Then Clara said, if you want this to mean something, don't let it be a project you move on from. Let it be something that costs you. He nodded once as if he already knew that. The next few weeks passed without another word between them, but the documents stayed on her desk, reviewed late at night with tired eyes and hesitant hope. And then came the invitation. A small card in her locker, no return address, just a date, a time, and the name. The Ray's Free Clinic reopening ceremony. She stood there holding it, breath caught in her throat. Clara hadn't been back to that part of town in years. Not since the last day she locked the clinic doors behind her, carrying the weight of her father's legacy like a stone in her chest. She almost didn't go. But when the day arrived, she found herself standing at the edge of the crowd in the renovated building's front lot, the winter sun catching on the new blue and white signage above the door. Families gathered, old colleagues reunited, children ran between legs. And there was Aiden standing off to the side in the shadow of a new mural, a painting of her father in his white coat, smiling. She walked up slowly. He noticed her but didn't reach out, didn't move. Why didn't you put your name on anything? She asked quietly. Because it's not mine, he said. She looked at the building. The new waiting room inside had the same layout, the same warmth. Even the old coffee machine had been replaced with one nearly identical. But this wasn't the past. It was something new built from its ashes. I don't know how to forgive you, she said finally. I don't expect you to. But I think I want to try. He turned to her then, and for the first time the look in his eyes wasn't guarded or defensive. It was hopeful, not with the desperation of a man wanting absolution, but with the quiet ache of someone willing to wait. They stood side by side as the ribbon was cut and the doors were opened once again. The world didn't shift, nothing grand or cinematic occurred. Just the soft rustle of wind through a new beginning. The clinic reopened with gentle momentum. It started with a single mother who needed insulin but couldn't afford her prescription. Then an elderly man with a failing heart valve, too proud to admit he had nowhere else to go. The waiting room filled slowly, like a well-remembered lullaby returning note by note. Volunteers showed up from all corners of the city, some who had worked with Dr. Ray's, others who had only heard stories of the clinic that had once been a safe haven. Clara returned cautiously, at first just once a week, then twice. She told herself it was only temporary, that her work at the hospital was still her anchor. But something about the clinic tugged at her in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't about nostalgia. It was about a promise, one she'd made in the quiet of her grief, when the only thing that held her together was the belief that her father's work had mattered. And Aiden was there. Not every day, not loudly. He didn't take credit for the funding, didn't appear in photos, but she noticed him in the details. The shelf of donated children's books in the corner, organized alphabetically. The new prenatal vitamins stocked quietly in the pharmacy, despite their high cost. The way he helped the maintenance worker on Saturdays, sleeves rolled up, pushing a mop bucket like it belonged to him. He didn't pretend to be part of the medical world, but he showed up. One evening, as the clinic lights dimmed and the last patient of the day stepped out into the gathering dusk, Clara found him in the back office, reviewing inventory sheets. You know you don't have to do that, she said, leaning against the doorframe. I know, he replied, glancing up, but it keeps me from checking emails I swore I wouldn't answer. She smiled faintly, the first real smile she'd given him in months. He leaned back in the chair, watching her with the kind of quiet that always made her wary. You've changed, she said, the words surprising even herself. He didn't look defensive, he looked grateful. I was never the man I thought I was, he admitted. I just lived in a world that let me believe I didn't need to be better. And now, I want to earn something real. She crossed the room, sitting in the chair across from him. I used to think I'd never stop hating you, she said. Not for what you did, but for what it did to him. My father never stopped believing that people could be better. He held on to that even when it broke him. Aiden nodded slowly. He was a better man than most. He was, she said, and part of me still thinks he'd want me to forgive you. Do you? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at the office walls bare, waiting for new memories. I think I'm learning how. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It felt like breath, like the moment before something delicate unfolds. They began spending more time together, not by design, but by slow, inevitable orbit. There were long evenings reviewing budgets, planning outreach, discussing policies. But there were also smaller moments, sharing coffee at the clinic's back step, teasing arguments over which pediatric toys to order, a shared laugh when a toddler bit Aiden's hand thinking it was a cookie. It wasn't a love story yet, but it was becoming one. The past lingered like a shadow between them. Some days Clara still pulled back when he looked at her for too long. Some nights when she passed the mural of her father, she felt guilt settle on her shoulders, quiet but stubborn. But Aiden never pushed. He walked beside her, not ahead. One night, after a particularly long shift, she found him outside in the courtyard. The clinic had installed new benches beneath the old maple tree her father once sat under with patience. Aiden had his coat draped over his lap, his face tilted toward the stars. She sat beside him without a word. He offered her the last of his tea. They sat in silence for a while, the air crisp, the city humming softly beyond the walls. Do you still feel like the man who ruined my life? She asked quietly. His answer came slowly. I feel like the man who once did, but I also feel like the man who's trying to rebuild something honest, with you. Clara looked at him. The bruises had long faded. The limp was barely noticeable now, but something inside him remained tender, changed. She could see it in the way he listened, in the way he didn't speak to be heard but to understand. I'm not sure where this is going, she said. I'm not asking you to be sure, he replied, just not to walk away. She reached for his hand then, hesitantly, almost uncertainly, but when her fingers brushed his, he didn't move. He didn't grab or cling, he just let her be the one to decide. And for the first time, Clara didn't feel like she was reliving the past. She felt like she was writing something new. The next morning she arrived at the clinic before sunrise. The front desk was still dark, the rooms quiet. She stepped into the exam room her father once used, the one with the high windows and the warm light. There, taped to the inside of the cabinet door, was an old note in her father's handwriting. There is no such thing as small kindness. Every one of them saves someone. She closed the door slowly, her hand over the words. Clara Reyes had once thought that the end of her father's clinic was the end of everything good she'd known. But maybe healing didn't come all at once. Maybe it came like this, slowly, with hard conversations and shared work, in the hands of someone she never thought she could trust. And now somehow did. Spring arrived in Greystone without announcement. It crept in through the branches of the city's trees, turned frost into dew, softened the edges of things that had felt sharp for too long. The Reyes Free Clinic bloomed with it, not in the obvious ways, but in the quiet signs of life that Clara had learned to look for. A toddler gripping a lollipop with sticky fingers after a flu shot. A teenager picking up a pamphlet about mental health with eyes that said more than words could. The soft laughter of nurses at shift change. Her father's name spoken again, not in mourning but in motion. Clara had stopped waiting for the ache in her chest to vanish. She knew now it wasn't something that disappeared, it settled, it changed shape. Some mornings it was barely a hum, others it flared without warning, but it no longer ruled her, it no longer stopped her from stepping forward. Aiden, too, had found rhythm in the ordinary. He kept his office small, tucked in the back, but rarely stayed in it. He worked the front desk sometimes, took notes during team meetings. When donors visited, he let Clara do the talking. His name wasn't on any plaque, and when he was thanked, he always deflected it toward others. He never asked for forgiveness again, but he earned it anyway. They hadn't defined what they were, no confessions, no declarations. It was something understood in glances, in the quiet way their days bled into each other. When Clara's car refused to start, Aiden showed up the next morning with a spare set of jumper cables and a thermos of her favorite coffee. When he got stuck writing a grant proposal, she sat across from him and edited until midnight. No grand romance, no sweeping gestures. Just presence. Just care. One evening, months after the reopening, the clinic hosted its first community health night. Food trucks lined the curb, volunteers handed out flyers, a small band played in the nearby park. Children darted between folding chairs and lawn blankets, their laughter wrapping around the clinic like ribbon. Clara stood at the edge of it all, watching the crowd with a kind of wonder she hadn't let herself feel in years. This was what her father had dreamed of: access, warmth, dignity, not numbers or awards, just people cared for. She turned and saw Aidan standing beneath the maple tree, his gaze not on her but on the mural again. He did that often, not with guilt anymore, with reverence. She crossed to him slowly. "He'd have liked you, you know," she said. Aidan looked at her, surprised. "Your father." She nodded. He believed that broken people still had something good to give, even the ones who didn't know they were broken. He was quiet a moment, then asked, "And what about you?" Clara met his eyes. "I'm starting to believe it too." The breeze moved around them, lifting strands of her hair, scattering blossoms across the sidewalk. A patient waved to her as they left, a little boy perched on their hip. She waved back. Aidan's hand found hers. This time she let her fingers tangle with his. "I used to think the worst thing I ever did was signing those papers," he said. "But I think the real damage came after, when I chose not to look at what it cost, not until I couldn't look away." Clara's voice was gentle. "Then maybe the bravest thing you've done is looking now." They stood together, not as a nurse and a CEO, not as the daughter of a man lost and the man who once helped lose him, but as two people still learning how to live with what they had done and what they still could do. The music faded into twilight, volunteers packed folding chairs, a light came on in the clinic window above them, the world kept turning. Later that night, as they locked the doors and turned out the lights, Clara walked Aidan to his car. "Walk me home," she said softly. He glanced at her, surprised, then smiled. "Yeah, of course." They moved down the sidewalk side by side, no rush, no destination but forward. And in the hush of early night, under a sky beginning to scatter with stars, the woman who had once saved a man's life walked beside the man who had once destroyed hers. Not because she had to, but because they had both chosen not to remain who they were. And because sometimes love didn't begin with perfection or promise. Sometimes it began with ruin, and grew quietly from what remained.